Every Tuesday morning, a sack of flour appeared on Jonas Whitmore's porch. No wagon tracks in the dust. No hoofprints near the gate. Just 20 pounds of white flour leaning against his door, still cool from wherever it had come. The burlap carried the faint smell of the mill, grain and heat and honest labor, but nothing else. No note, no explanation, no face attached to the gift. By the 6th week, Jonas stopped asking how. By the 10th, he forgot to wonder at all. This Tuesday was no different. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Wyoming Territory, the late October sky heavy with clouds that promised nothing and delivered less. Jonas stood on his porch in his undershirt and suspenders, coffee cup steaming in his hand, and stared at the flour sack like a man examining a strange rock that kept appearing in his garden. 20 pounds, same as always. Braden's mill stamp pressed into the burlap. Still faintly warm, which meant someone had placed it there recently. Within the last hour, maybe less. He looked out at the empty trail that wound down from his property toward Cedar Hollow, 8 miles southeast. Nothing moved except a hawk circling lazy above the ridge. The grass bent in the morning wind. His 47 head of cattle stood in clusters near the water tank, breath fogging in the chill. No tracks, no sound, no sign of who had come. Jonas carried the flour inside. The kitchen was dim, even with the curtains pulled back. Eleanor's apron still hung on the hook by the stove. Blue gingham faded from too many washes. He'd meant to take it down a dozen times. Meant to fold it up and put it in the cedar chest with her other things. But every time he reached for it, his hand stopped midair and he walked away instead. 2 years now. 2 years since the blood and the screaming and the silence that came after. 2 years since he'd buried her and the baby behind the cabin, in the little clearing where the wild roses grew in spring. The baby had lived 3 hours, long enough to look at him with eyes that didn't understand, long enough to stop looking. He set the flour on the counter beside the tin of beans he'd been eating from all week. The breadboard gathered dust in the corner. He knew how to make bread. Eleanor had taught him during their first winter together, but the effort seemed pointless now. Beans were easier. Beans didn't require thinking about her hands covered in flour, her laugh when the dough stuck to her fingers. Jonas poured the last of his coffee and stared at the flour sack. Someone was leaving it. That much was obvious. But who and why? He'd asked the question once, about a month ago, and gotten only shrugs and jokes in return. Now he'd stopped asking. The flour came. He used it occasionally. The mystery persisted. Life went on. Such as it was. The ride to Cedar Hollow took 75 minutes at an easy trot. Jonas made the trip every week or two for supplies he couldn't grow or raise himself. Coffee, salt, ammunition for the rifle he kept for coyotes, the occasional piece of mail that arrived from nowhere and said nothing important. The town consisted of 40-odd buildings strung along a main street that turned to mud every spring and dust every summer. Population 800 some, depending on who was counting, and whether they included the miners who came and went with the seasons. There was a church with a warped bell tower, a livery stable that smelled like old hay, and 3 saloons that did better business than anything else in town. The general store sat at the corner of Main and Prospect, a 2-story clapboard building with a sagging porch and a hand-painted sign that read Walker's Mercantile in letters that had once been red and were now something closer to brown. Jonas tied his horse to the rail and stepped inside. Clem Walker stood behind the counter, same as always. 62 years old, balding, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and a permanent expression of mild suspicion. He'd run the store for 30 years and had opinions about everything and everyone in Cedar Hollow. Most of those opinions were unflattering. Whitmore, Clem nodded once. Didn't expect to see you for another week. Ran out of coffee. Coffee. Clem turned to the shelf behind him, fingers running over tin canisters and paper bag. Colombian, or that cheap stuff from the coast. Cheap stuff. Cheap. 15 cents a pound. You want a full pound or half? Full. Loan me. Clem weighed out the coffee with the same careful motions Jonas had watched him perform 100 times. The scale creaked. The beans shifted. A small cloud of dust rose from the grinder. Heard anything strange lately? Jonas asked. The question came out before he could stop it. So much for not asking any more. Clem's hands paused. Strange how? Never mind. You're asking about the flour. A smile crept across Clem's face, the kind of smile that preceded a joke at someone else's expense. Word gets around, Whitmore. You've been asking half the territory who's leaving supplies on your porch. I asked a few people. You asked everybody, and nobody knows. Clem finished weighing the coffee and poured it into a paper bag. You want my theory? Jonas didn't, but Clem was going to share it anyway. Whitmore's got himself a ghost leaving flour. Clem's smile widened. Maybe it's your dead wife come back to feed you proper. Lord knows you look like you ain't eaten a real meal in a year. The words hit like a slap. Jonas felt his face harden, felt the familiar closing off that had become his default response to anything that touched Eleanor's memory. He pulled 2 coins from his pocket and set them on the counter. Just the coffee. I'm only saying, -EOL. Just the coffee. Clem shrugged and made change. 8 cents back from a quarter. Jonas pocketed the coins and turned to leave. Near the flour sacks by the front window, a woman stood with her back to him. Plain calico dress, brown or maybe faded blue, hard to tell in the dim store light. Hair pulled back severe. Dust on her boots. She was examining a bolt of fabric on the lower shelf, fingers running over the weave. Jonas walked past her toward the door. She turned slightly. Their eyes met. Nora Braden, the mill owner's daughter. He'd seen her 100 times in passing at church in town, standing behind her father when grain deliveries came through. Never really looked at her. Just registered her existence the way you register a fence post or a hitching rail. Part of the scenery. She nodded. He nodded back. Then he was outside, untying his horse, swinging into the saddle. The interaction had lasted 3 seconds. He'd already forgotten it by the time he reached the edge of town. He arrived home at dusk, the sky going purple and orange over the western ridge. His cabin sat small and square against the landscape, a single window glowing faint with the lamp he'd left burning. Smoke rose thin from the chimney. The cattle had moved to the sheltered side of the water tank, huddled against the evening chill. Jonas dismounted and led his horse to the barn. He was halfway through unsaddling when something caught his attention. The porch. There was flour on his porch. He'd left at mid-morning, been gone 6 hours, maybe 7. In that time, while he was in town asking stupid questions about ghost deliveries, someone had walked up to his door and left another sack. No. Wait. That couldn't be right. The flour had been there this morning. He'd carried it inside himself. He walked to the porch. The sack sat exactly where flour sacks always sat, leaning against the door frame. 20 pounds. Braden's mill stamp. Burlap still warm. Jonas picked it up. Warm. Definitely warm. Placed within the last hour. But the sack from this morning was inside. On his counter. He could see it through the window. This was a second sack. 2 deliveries in 1 day. That had never happened before. He carried it inside and set it beside the first. 2 identical sacks, both from Braden's mill, both weighing 20 pounds. One from this morning, one from... when? Late afternoon? While he was in town? That didn't make sense. If someone had delivered flour while he was away, they would have seen the sack from this morning still sitting on the porch. Why leave a second one? Unless they didn't know about the first one. unless there were two different people making deliveries. Or unless someone was watching him, knew his schedule, waited until he was away. Jonas stood in his dim kitchen and felt the first real flicker of curiosity he'd experienced in months. Something about this didn't add up. The careful timing, the lack of tracks, the precision of it all. Whoever was leaving this flower knew exactly what they were doing. Old Harlan Miller showed up the next morning, same as he did every week or so. 68 years old, white beard down to his chest, driving a buckboard that was older than some of the buildings in Cedar Hollow. He owned the property 2 miles east, had owned it for 40 years, since before the territory was the territory, since the only people for 100 miles were miners and trappers and the Arapaho who'd been here first. Jonas heard the wagon coming from a quarter-mile away. By the time Harlan pulled up to the cabin, Jonas had coffee brewing and 2 cups set out. They sat on the porch in the October cold, not saying much. That was their way. Harlan had known Eleanor, had been one of the few neighbors at the funeral, had helped Jonas dig the grave when the frozen ground refused to yield. He understood silence. After a while, Harlan's eyes drifted to the flour sacks visible through the open door. 2 of them now sitting on the counter like accusations. "That's new," Harlan said. "Been happening since late summer. Someone leaves flour every Tuesday. You don't know who? No tracks. No sound. Nothing." Jonas sipped his coffee. Asked around. Nobody admits to it. Harlan nodded slowly, the way he did when he was thinking. His fingers tapped against his cup. "You ever wonder about it?" "Used to. Stopped. "Why'd you stop?" Jonas shrugged. "Seemed pointless. Flour shows up. I use it. Does it matter who?" Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in that careful way of his, "You ever notice how the things that come easiest are usually paid for by someone else?" Jonas looked at him. "Coffee tastes good because someone picked the beans," Harlan continued. "Clothes fit because someone sewed them. Food appears on your porch because someone carried it there." He paused. "Just because you don't see the work, don't mean there ain't work being done." "You know who's doing it?" "No." Harlan shook his head. "But I know this. Somebody's thinking about you every week, going out of their way, using their time and their strength to make sure you eat. That ain't nothing, Jonas. That ain't nothing at all." Jonas stared into his coffee. The words sat heavy in his chest, uncomfortable. He'd been thinking of the flower as a puzzle to solve or a charity to tolerate. It hadn't occurred to him to think of it as a person who knew his routine, a person who cared. "Most folks," Harlan said, "spend their whole lives hoping someone will think about them that way. You've got it, and you don't even know who to thank. Maybe I don't want to be thought about." Harlan smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Eleanor used to say you were stubborn as a Missouri mule." She was right. She also used to say that underneath all that stubborn, you were the kindest man she'd ever met. Said you just needed someone to remind you of it. Harlan finished his coffee and set the cup down. Maybe that's what the flower's for, a reminder. He left a few minutes later, his buckboard creaking down the trail toward his own property. Jonas watched him go, then looked back at the flour sacks. A reminder of what? The next Tuesday, Jonas decided to catch whoever was leaving the flower. He planned it carefully. Lamp extinguished at sunset, same as always. Door closed, same as always. But instead of going to bed, he took his rifle and a blanket and settled into the rocking chair on the porch, wrapped against the October cold. The night was clear and moonlit. Stars burned overhead in numbers that still amazed him after 5 years in the territory. Back east, you saw a few dozen stars on a good night. Out here, you saw thousands, millions. The sky went on forever, and every inch of it was alive with light. He sat. He waited. The cold crept through the blanket, through his wool shirt, through the long underwear he put on as a precaution. His breath fogged in the air. His rifle lay across his knees. Chamber empty. He wasn't planning to shoot anyone. Just wanted something to hold. 1 hour passed. 2. The moon moved across the sky. A coyote howled somewhere far to the north, and another answered from the ridge above his property. The cattle shifted in their sleep, invisible in the darkness. 3 hours. Jonas's eyes grew heavy. He blinked, forced them open. Blinked again. The cold was making him sleepy, the darkness pressing in from all sides. By 4 in the morning, he was fighting to stay awake. By 5, he'd lost the fight. He woke to gray light and the sound of a meadowlark singing somewhere in the grass. The porch was empty. No flour. Had the delivery not come? Had he succeeded in scaring them off simply by being present? Then he smelled coffee. He turned toward the door. It was open. He'd left it closed, hadn't he? Inside, the wood stove was lit, and a pot of coffee sat on the back burner, steaming. What the hell? Jonas stood, rifle in hand, and stepped inside. The kitchen was exactly as he'd left it, except for the coffee and EOL. The flour sack, on the counter, same as always. Someone had walked past him while he slept. Walked past him, opened his door, started a fire, brewed coffee, left flour, and walked away. All without waking him. His heart was pounding now. Not from fear exactly, but from something close to it. The intimacy of the act. The audacity of it. Someone had been inside his home, had moved around his kitchen, had touched his things, and he'd slept through all of it. He examined the flour sack. Still warm. The burlap showed the same marks it always showed, 20 pounds Braden's mill, sewn shut with coarse thread. But there was something else. Something he'd never noticed before. Trail dust. Fine particles of dust clung to the bottom of the sack, worked into the weave of the burlap. Not road dust from a wagon. Wagons ran on packed dirt, and their dust was different, finer, almost silty. This was trail dust. Rocky, gritty, mixed with fragments of sage and dried grass. Jonas picked up the sack and turned it over in his hands. 8 miles of trail between here and Cedar Hollow. Most of it unpaved, barely more than a path worn by years of horse traffic. If someone had walked that trail carrying this sack. No, that was impossible. No one would walk 8 miles carrying 20 pounds of flour. Not when you could load it into a wagon. Not when you could send it by the supply delivery for $2. But the dust told a different story. The dust said someone had carried this sack on foot, through territory that no wagon touched. Jonas set the flour down and stood very still. Something about this was wrong. Not dangerous wrong. He didn't feel threatened, but wrong in a way that demanded answers. Why would someone walk 8 miles to deliver flour? And why would they do it every single week? The investigation, such as it was, began the next morning. Jonas started with his nearest neighbors. Tom Carey's place lay 2 miles east. A modest spread was 60 head of cattle and a wife who made the best apple pie in the territory. Jonas rode over and found Tom repairing a section of fence near the road. Whitmore. Tom straightened up, hammer in hand. Something wrong? Just asking around. You know anything about someone leaving supplies on my porch? Flour, specifically. Tom's face showed nothing but honest confusion. Flour? You mean like delivery? Every Tuesday, 20 pounds. No tracks, no nothing, just shows up. Can't help you there. We get our flour from the supply wagon. Same as everyone. Tom scratched his chin. You tried asking at the mill. Braden might know something. Jonas thanked him and rode on. Widow Patterson lived 4 miles south, alone since her husband died of fever 3 winters ago. She answered the door in a dress that had seen better decades, her eyes wary until she recognized Jonas. "Mr. Whitmore, I thought you were the tax collector." "Just me, ma'am. Asking about flour deliveries." "Flour?" She shook her head. "Haven't left my property in 3 weeks. Bad knee. Can barely make it to the privy, let alone all the way to your place. Sorry to bother you." "No bother, but you might try asking that Braden girl, the one who works at the mill. She handles most of their deliveries, I hear." Jonas's ears perked up. "Nora Braden? That's the one. Plain little thing, always covered in flour dust. Walks to town and back every day because her father won't let her use the horse. Says she doesn't deserve it." The widow's expression soured. "Amos Braden's a hard man. Don't know how she stands living with him." Samuel Green, 3 miles north, laughed outright when Jonas asked his question. "A ghost flour delivery? That's rich, Whitmore. Maybe you got a secret admirer." "I'm serious." "So am I. Someone's sweet on you. Leaving you gifts, trying to get your attention." Samuel grinned. "You're a decent-looking fellow, all things considered. Got your own land, your own cattle. There's worse catches in the territory." "I don't want to catch. I want to know who's doing this. Then ask around in town. Somebody knows something." Samuel paused. "Though if I were you, I'd just enjoy the free flour and stop asking questions. Sometimes the mystery's better than the answer." Jonas rode to Braden's mill. It sat at the edge of Cedar Hollow, a large timber structure with a water wheel that turned lazy in the creek. Grain came in from 6 local farms ground into flour, and shipped out to stores and bakeries as far as Cheyenne. Amos Braden had run the operation for 20 years, building it from a one-man grinding stone into the largest mill in the territory. Jonas had never liked Amos. Something about the man's eyes, hard and calculating, like he was always measuring your worth and finding you lacking. He tied his horse to the rail and walked inside. The mill was loud with the grinding of stones and the splash of water, the air thick with flour dust that caught in the throat and made you cough. 3 workers moved between the bins and the sifting tables, their clothes white with powder. Amos Braden stood at a ledger near the back, making notes with a pencil worn down to a stub. "Whitmore." He didn't look up. "What do you want?" "Asking about flour deliveries. We sell flour. We don't deliver. You want flour, you buy it from walkers like everyone else. Someone's been leaving flour at my place. Every Tuesday. Your mill stamp on the sacks." Now Amos looked up. His eyes were exactly as Jonas remembered, hard, suspicious, devoid of warmth. "Leaving it? What, like a gift?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." "Not my concern. I sell to walkers. What happens after that is between him and the customer." Amos returned to his ledger. "Anything else?" "I heard your daughter handles deliveries sometimes." Amos's pencil stopped moving. "Nora. She works here, doesn't she? She keeps books, sweeps floors." Amos's voice had gone cold. "She doesn't handle deliveries. She doesn't talk to customers. She doesn't leave the mill except to walk home at night. I just thought, dash eel." "You thought wrong." Amos set his pencil down and fixed Jonas with a stare that could have frozen water. "My daughter isn't part of whatever foolishness you're investigating. She's got no business with you or anyone else. Now, is there something I can actually help you with, or are you wasting my time?" Jonas held the stare for a moment, then backed down. There was no winning an argument with Amos Braden. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew that. "No, sorry to bother you." He turned to leave, and that's when he saw her. Nora stood in the doorway to the back office, a broom in her hands, her dress covered in flour dust. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, something between fear and hope and resignation. Their eyes met. She looked away immediately, turning back to her sweeping with mechanical precision. Jonas walked out into the autumn air and stood by his horse for a long moment. He was thinking about her hands. He'd noticed them at the store, rough and calloused, cracked at the knuckles. Strange for someone who kept books and swept floors. Those were working hands, carrying hands, walking hands. But that was ridiculous. She was slight, barely 5 feet tall, couldn't weigh more than 100 pounds. The idea of her carrying a 20-pound sack 8 miles over rough trail was absurd, wasn't it? Clem Walker found him at the saloon that evening. Jonas hadn't been planning to drink. He'd stopped at the Silver Dollar to ask the bartender a few questions, and somehow 1 drink had become 3. Now he sat at a corner table, staring into his whiskey, trying to make sense of pieces that wouldn't fit together. Clem slid into the chair across from him. "Heard you went to the mill today. News travels fast. This is Cedar Hollow. News travels before it happens." Clem helped himself to Jonas's bottle and poured a shot. "You asked about Nora Braden. I asked about flour deliveries. Same thing, ain't it?" Clem drained his shot and wiped his mouth. "You think she's the one leaving it?" "I don't know what I think. Let me tell you what I think." Clem leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You start asking questions about that girl, you might not like what you find. Leave well enough alone, Whitmore. Some things are meant to stay mysteries." "What's that supposed to mean?" Clem shrugged. "It means Nora Braden's got enough trouble without some rancher poking around in her business. Her father's a hard man. Keeps her on a short leash. She don't need you making things worse. I'm not trying to make things worse. I just want to know, EOL. What? Who's been feeding you for free for 3 months? Why someone cares whether you eat or starve." Clem shook his head. Most men would be grateful. Most men would just say thank you and move on. I don't know who to thank. Maybe that's the point. Clem stood up and adjusted his spectacles. Maybe whoever's doing this doesn't want your thanks. Maybe they just want you to keep living. He paused at the edge of the table. Think about that, Whitmore. Think about what kind of person gives without expecting anything back. Then ask yourself if you really want to drag them into the light. He walked away, leaving Jonas alone with his whiskey and his questions. Sunday came, cold and gray. Jonas rode to church for the first time in months. He told himself it was for the community, for the appearance of normalcy, for the chance to hear something other than his own thoughts rattling around in his empty head. But really, if he was honest, he went because Nora Braden would be there. The church was small, white-clappered, with a bell tower that listed slightly to the left. Inside, wooden pews worn smooth by decades of use, and an altar decorated with dried flowers and a cross made from local timber. The congregation gathered slowly, families and couples and lone figures like Jonas, all taking their places according to some unwritten seating chart. He sat in the back pew, same place he'd sat for every service before Eleanor died. She used to tease him about it, said he was like a schoolboy trying to hide from the teacher. He told her he just liked being able to see everyone's backs. Easier to watch, easier to slip out early if the sermon ran long. Now he sat in the back because the back was where people went when they didn't want to be seen. The Braden family sat 3 pews from the front. Amos, stiff and upright, his wife beside him. Jonas had never learned her name. She never spoke, never looked up, never seemed to exist except as an extension of her husband. And Nora at the end of the pew, head bowed, hands folded in her lap. Jonas watched her through the entire service. Her clothes were clean but worn, the same style she'd worn at the store. Plain, practical, unadorned. Her hair was still pulled back severe, not a strand out of place. She didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't look up. Just sat with perfect stillness, like someone who had learned long ago to make herself invisible. But there were her hands. Even from across the room, Jonas could see them. Red and rough, the skin cracked at the knuckles, calluses visible on her palms. Those weren't the hands of someone who kept books and swept floors. Those were the hands of someone who worked. Really worked. The kind of work that left marks. After the service, people gathered in the yard to talk. Jonas hung back, trying to look casual, waiting for what? He wasn't sure. A chance to approach her. A sign of some kind? But Nora didn't linger. The moment the final hymn ended, she was moving, slipping out the side door, walking fast across the yard toward the road. Her parents didn't seem to notice or care. Jonas watched her go. She walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She walked like someone who had somewhere to be and no time to waste. She walked like someone who was used to walking. 8 miles each way, the widow had said, every day to and from the mill. That was 16 miles of walking, every single day. Jonas didn't follow her, but he didn't stop watching until she disappeared over the ridge. Monday night, he made his decision. He wouldn't wait on his porch this time. Wouldn't try to catch whoever was coming. Instead, he would go to them. He would leave before dawn, ride toward town, and intercept the mystery deliverer on the trail. He barely slept. At 2 a.m, he was already awake, pulling on his boots, saddling his horse in the darkness. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see the trail, bright enough to spot anyone moving across the landscape. At 2:30, he rode out. The trail to Cedar Hollow wound through low hills and sage flats, crossing a creek at the 3-mile mark, then climbing gradually toward the ridge that overlooked the valley where the town sat. Jonas rode slowly, staying to the side of the main path, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. 1 hour passed. Nothing. Then, at the base of the ridge, he saw it. A figure, walking, carrying something heavy on one shoulder. Jonas's heart slammed against his ribs. He dismounted and tied his horse to a juniper, then moved on foot, keeping low, using the terrain for cover. 200 yards, 150. The figure stopped. It was near a large boulder that marked the halfway point between Cedar Hollow and his ranch. The figure set down its burden, a sack, from the shape of it, and stretched, flexing shoulders and rolling its head. The moon chose that moment to emerge from behind a wisp of cloud, and light fell across the figure's face. Nora Braden. She stood with her head tilted back, eyes closed, breathing hard. The sack at her feet was unmistakable, 20 pounds, burlap, Braden's mill stamp. She was wearing the same plain dress he'd seen at church, but over it was a heavy wool coat that hung past her knees. Her boots were covered in dust. 8 miles from town. 4 more to go. And she was carrying that sack on foot. Jonas couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He watched as she reached down, grasped the sack by its gathered top, and swung it back onto her shoulder. The effort made her stagger slightly. She braced herself, found her balance, and started walking again. He followed. For the next 90 minutes, he walked behind her, silent as a ghost, watching her struggle with the weight. She stopped 3 more times to rest, each time setting the sack down with visible relief, each time picking it up with visible effort. Her pace slowed as the miles accumulated. Her limp became more pronounced. By the time the roof of his cabin appeared on the horizon, she was barely moving, faster than a shuffle. But she didn't stop. She didn't quit. She kept walking, 1 foot in front of the other, carrying 20 pounds of flour through the pre-dawn darkness. For him. Jonas watched her climb the last hill to his property, watched her approach the cabin with careful steps, checking the windows for light, listening for any sign of movement. Watched her set the flour sack against his door, her hands lingering on the burlap for just a moment, like a mother tucking in a child. Then she turned to leave, and saw him. He was standing 30 feet away, in the gray light of approaching dawn. He hadn't meant to be seen, hadn't meant to do anything except watch and understand. But now here they were, facing each other across a distance that suddenly felt much smaller than 30 feet. Neither of them spoke. 4 seconds. 5. The wind moved through the grass. A bird called somewhere in the distance. She ran. Not toward him, not past him, away. Back down the trail. Back toward Cedar Hollow. 8 more miles of rocky terrain and dusty path, after she'd already walked 8 miles to reach him. Jonas stood frozen, watching her disappear into the morning light. He looked down at the flour sack she'd left, still warm from her hands. 20 pounds of white powder that meant nothing to him and everything to her. 3 months, 12 deliveries, 96 miles of walking, minimum, probably more, counting the trips to buy the flour in the first place. All for him, a man who barely knew her name, a man who'd never so much as said hello. Why? He picked up the flour and carried it inside. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove. The beans in the tin were untouched. Jonas looked at the rows of flour sacks he'd accumulated, 10 of them now, lined up on the counter and the floor, each one representing 8 miles of her feet on that trail. He counted. 10 weeks, 20 deliveries, 160 miles. And that was just what he'd noticed. The first sacks had appeared in late summer. How many had there been before he started paying attention? How many miles had she walked while he was sleeping or working or staring at walls? 40 weeks maybe. Since May, that was -EOL. He did the math in his head. 40 weeks, 40 deliveries, 320 miles, each way. 640 miles of walking. For flour, for him. His legs gave out. Jonas sat down hard on the kitchen chair, the one Eleanor used to use, the one that still smelled faintly of her soap after 2 years. He put his head in his hands and felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen solid since the baby stopped breathing in his arms. He didn't know what to do. Didn't know what to feel. The scale of what she'd done was incomprehensible. The selflessness of it. The madness of it. Who walked 600 miles for a stranger. Who gave that much of themselves for nothing in return. And he hadn't even noticed. Had used her flour for biscuits and gravy. Had fed some to the dog. Had stared at it every Tuesday and felt nothing but vague curiosity. What kind of man was he? What kind of man had he become? By mid-morning, he'd composed himself enough to ride to town. He went to the Braden house first, a 2-story clapboard near the mill, painted white with green shutters. Nice enough from the outside. Respectable. The kind of house that belonged to someone who'd done well for himself. Jonas knocked. Amos Braden opened the door. Whitmore. His eyes narrowed. What now? I need to speak with your daughter. She's not available. It's important. She's not available. Amos moved to close the door. Whatever business you think you have with her, you're mistaken. Nora doesn't see visitors. Doesn't have conversations. Doesn't exist for anyone outside this family. I just want to thank her. That stopped Amos mid-motion. Thank her? For what? Jonas hesitated. He didn't want to explain, didn't want to expose what she'd been doing if Amos didn't already know. But he needed to see her, needed to say something. For her kindness, he said finally. She's been kind to me. I wanted her to know I noticed. Amos stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly his expression hardened into something ugly. Whatever kindness you think my daughter showed you, you imagined it. She doesn't have time for kindness. She has work to do. Debts to repay. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I don't know what game you're playing, Whitmore, but it ends now. Stay away from my daughter. Stay away from this house. If I see you here again, there'll be consequences." The door slammed in Jonas's face. He stood on the porch, chest tight with frustration. Through the window beside the door, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow that might have been Nora, watching from the stairs. Then the curtain fell, and there was nothing. He tried again the next day, and a day after that. Each time, Amos blocked the door. Each time, Nora remained invisible. By the third attempt, Amos wasn't just dismissive, he was threatening. "One more visit, Whitmore. One more, and I'll have the sheriff involved." In the general store that afternoon, the whispers reached his ears. Cedar Hollow was talking. The rancher who kept showing up at the mill. The rancher who couldn't leave the Braden girl alone. The rancher who'd followed a woman in the dark. Jonas hadn't told anyone about the trail. But somehow the town knew. Clem found him again, this time in broad daylight on Main Street. "You followed her?" His voice was incredulous. "What kind of man spies on a woman in the dark?" "She was trying to help you, Whitmore. And you made her feel like a thief caught stealing. I didn't mean -eel. You didn't ask. That's worse. She's been walking 8 miles every Tuesday for months, carrying your flour, keeping you fed, and you repay her by stalking her through the wilderness?" Clem shook his head. "She won't leave her house now. Won't go to the mill. Amos is telling everyone you're harassing his daughter. I just wanted to thank her." "Then you should have done it a long time ago, before you made her run." Jonas stopped going to town. He stayed on his ranch, tending cattle, fixing fences, eating beans from tin cans because the flour sacks on his counter made him sick to look at. Every time he saw them, he saw her, struggling with a weight, limping through the darkness, walking 8 miles to feed a man who couldn't even be bothered to notice. Friday night, he found himself at Eleanor's grave. The wooden cross had weathered over 2 years, the paint fading, the edges softening. He carved her name himself, and the baby's. Though the baby had never been named. They'd run out of time for names. He sat beside the mound of earth and talked to her for the first time in months. "I didn't see her, Eleanor. I didn't see anyone. Not since you left." His voice cracked. "I stopped seeing people. Stopped noticing kindness. Just walked around with my eyes closed, taking whatever came, giving nothing back. The wind moved through the wild roses, dry stems rattling against each other. Someone cared about me. Really cared. And I didn't even know her name until 3 days ago. She walked 600 miles for me. 600 miles, Eleanor. And I ate her flour like it was nothing. Like it came from nowhere. Like it cost nothing." He pressed his palm against the cold earth. "What happened to me? What happened to the man you married?" No answer came. The dead don't speak. But Jonas stayed there anyway, sitting in the darkness, letting the cold seep into his bones. Old Harlan found him at dawn. Jonas hadn't moved all night. His clothes were wet with dew, his face numb from the cold. He was sitting exactly where he'd been 8 hours earlier, staring at Eleanor's grave. Harlan didn't say anything at first. Just sat down beside him, groaning slightly as his old joints protested. They watched the sun rise together, the sky going pink and gold, the ridge turning from shadow to stone. Finally, Harlan spoke. "Been a long time since you came out here." "Yeah, must be something important." Jonas told him everything. The flower, the trail, Nora's face in the moonlight, the way she'd run, the way the town was talking, the way Amos had threatened him. Harlan listened without interrupting. When Jonas finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, The question isn't why she did it. You know why she did it. She saw a man disappearing and didn't want to let him go. But I didn't. Dash. EOL. The question is what you're going to do now that you know. Jonas looked at him. I can't even see her. Amos won't let me near the house. You tried talking. Yeah? Talking's easy. Anyone can talk. Harlan's eyes held a challenge. What did it cost her to help you? What would it cost you to help her? I don't understand. She walked 8 miles every week. In the dark. Alone. Carrying 20 pounds on her back. Harlan paused. When's the last time you did anything that hard for someone else? Jonas didn't answer. He didn't have to. Worth isn't measured in what arrives, Harlan said. It's measured in what it costs to bring. You know the cost now. The question is, what will you bring her? Jonas spent Saturday thinking. He thought about Eleanor, who had taught him to bake bread. He thought about the baby, who had never tasted anything at all. He thought about 2 years of emptiness, of closing off, of turning himself into a stone that nothing could touch. He thought about Nora. She'd seen him at his worst. Seen him walk past her without looking. Heard him ask questions about her like she was a puzzle to solve instead of a person to know. She'd carried flour 8 miles in the darkness while he slept on his porch. And when he'd finally caught her, she'd run. Not because she was ashamed. Because she didn't want anything back. Didn't want thanks or recognition or reward. Just wanted him to keep living. And he hadn't lived. Not really. Not for 2 years. What would it cost to change that? By Sunday morning, he had his answer. He would walk those 8 miles. Not ride, walk. Feel every step she'd felt. Carry something on his shoulders, the way she'd carried something on hers. And at the end of the walk, he would find her. He would look her in the eyes. And he would say the things he should have said months ago. He filled a grain sack from his stores. 25 pounds of wheat, more than she'd carried, because he was bigger and stronger and had something to prove. He set it by the door and went to sleep early. At 2 in the morning, he woke. At 2:30, he started walking. The first 3 miles weren't bad. The trail was flat, the weight manageable, the cold night air sharp in his lungs. He walked at a steady pace, his boots crunching on the gravel and dirt, the grain sack balanced on his right shoulder. By mile 4, his shoulders were burning. He'd carried heavy things before. Feed sacks, fence posts, calves that wouldn't walk. But there was something different about carrying weight for miles. The steady, relentless pressure. The way every step transmitted through your spine. The way your muscles screamed for relief and got none. By mile 5, he was limping. A blister had formed on his left heel, right where his boot rubbed against the bone. He could feel it with every step, hot and tight and getting worse. But he didn't stop. She hadn't stopped. She'd walked this trail with the same weight, with the same blisters, with the same screaming muscles, and she'd done it 50 times. By mile 6, he understood. This wasn't charity. This wasn't kindness. This was sacrifice, real sacrifice, the kind that cost you something, the kind that left marks. Every Tuesday, Nora Braden had given him a piece of herself, a piece of her strength, a piece of her time, a piece of her body. And he'd used it without thinking, without gratitude, without even curiosity. By mile 7, he wanted to quit. His legs were shaking. His shoulders had gone numb and then started hurting again, a deeper pain that reached into his bones. The grain sack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, 200, 1,000. But he didn't quit. Because she hadn't quit. Because she'd walked the same trail with the same weight, and she'd done it for someone who didn't deserve it. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to say thank you. Mile 8. The edge of Cedar Hollow came into view, the church steeple first, then the rooftops, then the mill's water wheel turning slow in the morning light. Jonas staggered down the main street, past buildings that were just starting to wake up, past early risers who stared at the dusty rancher carrying a grain sack like his life depended on it. He reached the mill at dawn. The door was closed, but there was smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was already awake, already working. Jonas set the grain sack against the door, the same way she'd set flour against his door, week after week, and stepped back. The door opened. Nora stood there in her plain calico dress, flour dust already on her sleeves. She looked at him, at the sack, at his dusty clothes and his exhausted face and his hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "You walked," she said. I walked. 4 seconds. 5. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. "Why?" she asked. "Because I needed to know what it cost. And I needed you to see that I finally know." She didn't speak, just stood in the doorway, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe. Sincerity. Something that proved he wasn't lying. Across the street, a figure emerged from the general store. Clem Walker, early for the morning delivery. He stopped when he saw Jonas. Stopped and stared and slowly, very slowly, removed his hat. He didn't say anything. Just nodded once, then walked away.
Nora stepped outside. They stood in the morning light, the two of them facing each other across a distance that had nothing to do with feet or inches. He was dirty and exhausted. She was quiet and careful, and between them lay months of misunderstanding and silence.
"I should have seen you," Jonas said. "From the beginning. At the store. At church. On the trail. I should have seen you, and I didn't. You were grieving. That's not an excuse. It's a reason." She wrapped her arms around herself, the same way she'd done after church, protecting herself from what? Him, the cold, the memory of running through the darkness.
"I saw you that day Eleanor died. I was in the crowd outside your cabin. I saw them carry her out." Jonas's breath caught. She looked peaceful, even after everything. She looked like she was just sleeping. Nora's voice was barely above a whisper. "And you look like someone had pulled the heart right out of your chest." They had. "I know." She finally met his eyes. "My mother died when I was 12. Same way, childbirth. The baby lived 3 days, then followed her. I watched my father turn into a stone after that. Watched him close off from everything and everyone. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I didn't make trouble, he'd come back. He'd remember how to be alive." Did he? No. The word was flat, final. He never came back. He just got harder, meaner, started looking at me like I was the reason she was gone. Jonas felt something crack in his chest, the same something that had cracked when he'd sat at Eleanor's grave. Only this time, it didn't crack open with grief. It cracked open with recognition. "When I saw you disappearing," Nora continued, I couldn't watch it happen again. Not to someone else. So I started bringing flour. Because I couldn't think of anything else to do. Because it was small and secret and you'd never have to know. You'd just have something. Someone would remember you existed. For 3 months. For 40 weeks since May.
40 weeks. Jonas had done the math before, but hearing her say it made it real. "That's 640 miles, he said, "at least." I didn't count. I did. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to make the distance feel smaller. I counted every sack, every mile, every Tuesday I slept through while you were walking through the darkness.
"I didn't want you to know." "I know, that's what makes it." He stopped. Swallowed. Started again. "If I had to ask you to see me, you never really would. That's what you said to Clem, isn't it?" Her eyes widened. He told you? No, but he might as well have. The whole town's been talking about the rancher who couldn't see what was right in front of him.
Jonas reached out slowly and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and rough and cracked at the knuckles, and they were beautiful. I see you now, Nora. I see every mile, every Tuesday, every pound of flour my careless hands used without thanks. She was crying. Silent tears, the kind that came without warning and wouldn't stop. I don't want your thanks, she whispered. I know. You wanted me to keep living. He squeezed her hand gently. I wasn't living. I was surviving. There's a difference. And I think I finally understand what that difference is. They stood there in the morning light, holding hands, while the town woke up around them. People passed by on the street. Some stared, some whispered, but Jonas didn't care. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't trying to be invisible. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful. Jonas walked to town every Tuesday, not carrying flour, but carrying himself, his attention, his presence. He'd show up at the mill at dawn and wait for Nora to finish her morning tasks, then walk her home the long way. 8 miles of conversation, 8 miles of getting to know each other.
She told him about her mother, about the books she'd read in secret, about the dreams she'd had before her father crushed them all. She told him about the walking, how it had started as penance and become prayer, how the repetition had given her time to think, how the exhaustion had given her something to feel besides grief.
He told her about Eleanor, about the baby, about the way he'd built walls so high and thick that nothing could touch him, and how those walls had also kept everything out. He told her about the grave behind the cabin, about the wild roses, about the night he'd finally spoken to Eleanor again. They walked and they talked, and slowly, so slowly it almost wasn't happening, they started to heal. His nephew Thomas arrived in early November. 12 years old, hair sticking up at awkward angles, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big that his mother had insisted on for the stagecoach journey. He'd come from Denver to spend the month on the ranch, sent by Jonas's sister, who thought country air would do him good. Thomas was polite and curious and utterly baffled by ranch life. "Why don't you have a telephone?" he asked the first morning. "Nearest telephone is in Cheyenne. Why don't you have electricity? Nearest electricity is probably in New York. Why do you walk everywhere? Don't you have horses?" Jonas laughed, actually laughed, a sound he'd almost forgotten how to make. Sometimes walking is better. Thomas didn't believe him. Not at first. But by the end of his first week, after watching Jonas and Nora return from yet another 8-mile walk, pink-cheeked and peaceful, he started to wonder. "Why do you walk so far?" he asked one evening. "You could ride." Jonas thought about the question, thought about the answer. Then he sat down on the porch and beckoned Thomas to join him. "Let me tell you a story," he said. He told Thomas everything. About the flower that appeared on his porch. About the mystery he'd failed to solve. About the woman who'd walked 600 miles for a stranger because she couldn't bear to watch him disappear. Thomas listened with wide eyes. 600 miles, he repeated when Jonas finished. "At least. That's a lot." "Yeah. And you didn't even know?" "Not until I followed her. Not until I saw with my own eyes." Jonas paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Here's what I learned, Thomas. Worth isn't measured in what arrives. It's measured in what it costs to bring. When someone gives you something, anything, ask yourself what it cost them. Then make sure they know you saw." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that why you walk now? To show her you saw?" "Partly, but also because walking taught me something." Jonas looked out at the ridge, where the setting sun painted everything gold. When you walk 8 miles, you have time to think, time to feel, time to notice things you'd miss on horseback. The way the light changes, The way the grass moves. The way another person breathes when they're beside you. It sounds nice. It is. Jonas smiled. It's the nicest thing I've done in years. The next week, Clem Walker did something remarkable. He apologized. Jonas was at the general store, buying coffee and salt when Clem cleared his throat and said, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I was wrong about you." Clem took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his apron, a nervous habit Jonas had never noticed before. "I thought you were being foolish. Following that girl. Making a spectacle of yourself. I told everyone you were harassing her. I heard. But then I watched you walk into town that morning. Watched you set that grain sack by her door. And I thought, that's not a man harassing anyone. That's a man trying to understand." Clem put his spectacles back on. "I spent 30 years watching transactions in this town. Flour for money. Labor for wages. Never once saw someone pay that price for nothing in return. And I never saw a man walk that far just to say he finally understood." Jonas didn't know what to say. Clem had been his harshest critic, and now... "If I'm being honest," Clem continued, "I was jealous. Nobody ever walked 8 miles for me. Nobody ever cared that much." He extended his hand across the counter. "You're a lucky man, Whitmore. Don't waste it." Jonas shook his hand. December came cold and clear. Jonas had added a second rocking chair to his porch, built it himself over 12 hours of careful work, cutting the pine, carving the joints, sanding everything smooth. Nora's chair sat beside his, close enough that their shoulders could touch if they wanted. The flour sacks were gone from the counter. He'd used them all, baking bread the way Eleanor had taught him, making biscuits and gravy and all the things he'd forgotten how to want. The kitchen smelled like home again, like life. The grave behind the cabin had fresh flowers, dried roses from the wild bush wrapped in ribbon. He visited every week now, talking to Eleanor, telling her about Nora, about Thomas, about all the small ways his world was expanding. He told her the truth. "I loved you," he said. "I'll always love you. But I think you'd want me to live. Really live, not just survive. And that's what I'm trying to do." The wind moved through the roses. The sun set over the ridge. And Jonas walked back to his cabin, where Nora was waiting on the porch, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the evening cold. "How is she?" Nora asked. "Good. Resting. Do you think she'd like me?" Jonas sat down beside her and took his coffee. "She'd love you. She'd say you were exactly what I needed." "What's that?" "Someone who wouldn't let me disappear." The trail stretched 8 miles toward town. 8 miles back, 16 miles of dust and rock and silence. Once it had been her burden. Now it was their bridge. Some distances, Jonas Whitmore learned, aren't meant to be shortened. They're meant to be walked together. On the first really cold day of December, when the wind howled down from the mountains and the snow threatened but didn't fall, Jonas and Nora stood on his porch looking out at the trail. Thomas was inside, trying to learn how to bake bread and making a mess of the kitchen. Harlan's buckboard had come and gone, delivering winter supplies and gossip from the territory. "I have a question," Nora said. "Ask it."
Would you have noticed me? If I hadn't left the flour. Jonas thought about it, really thought. "No," he said finally. "I wouldn't have. I wasn't seeing anyone. I closed my eyes to everything. And now?"
"Now I see everything." He turned to look at her, really look, the way he'd failed to look for so long. Her plain dress, her rough hands, her eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "I see you." She smiled. It was the same smile he'd seen that first morning at the mill, tentative, hopeful, surprised by its own existence. "That's all I ever wanted," she said. "I know." He reached for her hand. But you deserve more than just being seen. You deserve to be thanked, to be celebrated, to be—" He stopped, swallowed. "To be loved. Jonas, Mo. I'm not good at this. I wasn't good at it even before Eleanor. I say the wrong things. I miss obvious signals. I walk around with my eyes closed more often than I should." He squeezed her hand. "But I'm learning, and I want to keep learning. With you." The wind moved through the yard. The cattle shifted in their pasture. Somewhere, a hawk called. "Okay," Nora said. "Okay?"
Okay, you can keep learning. With me. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. But I have one condition. Name it. We walk together every Tuesday. 8 miles to town. 8 miles back, for as long as we're both breathing.
Jonas smiled. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. But it also felt right. "Deal," he said. And there, on the porch of a ranch that had been lonely for too long, in the December cold that promised winter and the December light that promised spring, they sealed it with a kiss. Some distances aren't meant to be shortened. Some weights aren't meant to be lifted alone. And some people, the ones who walk 8 miles in the darkness to feed a stranger's hunger, deserve to be seen. Jonas Whitmore learned all of this late. Learned it after months of blindness and years of grief. Learned it by following a woman through the night and discovering that kindness doesn't always announce itself. But he learned it. And that, in the end, was what mattered. The flowers still came. Not from Nora's back anymore. Jonas wouldn't allow that. But from a proper delivery, paid for and accounted for. But every Tuesday, he woke before dawn and walked to town anyway. And every Tuesday, she walked with him. 8 miles there, 8 miles back. 16 miles of shared silence and conversation. 16 miles of learning each other. 16 miles of building something that had started with a mystery and ended with a home. Thomas went back to Denver in late December, full of stories about ranch life and walking trails, and a couple who loved each other in the strangest way he'd ever seen. He told his mother about it. She told her friends. The story spread. By spring, people were traveling from 3 counties away to see the rancher and the mill girl who'd found each other through flower and footsteps. Some thought it was romantic. Some thought it was foolish. But everyone agreed it was something. Jonas didn't care what they thought. He had Nora. He had his ranch. He had the trail stretching out between one home and another. He had enough. On the first warm day of April, they walked the trail together one more time. Not because they needed to, just because they wanted to. Just because some rituals become part of who you are, woven so deeply into your bones that you couldn't give them up even if you tried. At the halfway point, the boulder where Jonas had first seen her face in the moonlight, they stopped to rest. The wild flowers were blooming around them, purple and yellow and white. The creek was running high with snowmelt. The world was alive in a way it hadn't been for 2 years. "I've been thinking," Nora said. "About what?"
About what happens next. She was looking out at the mountains, her eyes distant. We've been walking this trail for 6 months. Every Tuesday. Rain or shine or snow. I know. But we always walk it separately. You to town, me to your ranch. We meet in the middle and walk together, but we always end up in different places. Jonas waited. What if we ended up in the same place? She turned to look at him. What if we stopped walking away from each other? He felt his heart pound. Are you asking -Yoel? I'm asking if she'd want me to stay. Not visit, stay. Wake up in the same cabin. Walk the same trail. Build the same life.
Jonas didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I want that. I've wanted it since the first morning at the mill. I just didn't know how to say it. Then say it now." He took both her hands in his, looked into her eyes, those eyes that had seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. "Nora Braden," he said, "will you stay with me? Will you make my home your home? Will you walk beside me for as long as we're both breathing?" She was crying again. But this time, the tears came with a smile. "Yes," she said. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." The wedding was small. Just Jonas and Nora, old Harlan and his wife, Clem Walker, who gave the bride away, since Amos Braden had refused to attend, and a handful of neighbors who'd watched the whole story unfold. The preacher said the words. The couple said their vows. And then, instead of rice or flowers, the guests threw handfuls of flour, white powder that settled on their hair and their clothes and their smiling faces. Someone laughed, someone cheered, and then everyone was laughing and cheering. And Jonas was lifting Nora off her feet and spinning her around in the afternoon light. "You're covered in flour," she said. "So are you."
I've been covered in flour for years. It's practically my natural state. Good. He set her down but didn't let go. Because I plan to keep you covered in flour for the rest of your life, as a reminder. Of what? Of what it cost. Of what you gave. Of why I'm the luckiest man in the Wyoming Territory. She kissed him. The flour settled around them like snow. And somewhere, Jonas knew, Eleanor was smiling.
Epilogue. 5 years later, the trail between Jonas's ranch and Cedar Hollow was still there. Still dusty in summer, muddy in spring, frozen in winter. Still 8 miles each way, 16 miles round trip. But now there was a child on the trail. Her name was Eleanor, Ellie for short, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn streak. She was 4 years old and already insisted on walking part of the way herself. Tiny boots kicking up dust, tiny hands reaching for wildflowers. "Daddy," she said one Tuesday morning, "why do we walk so much?" Jonas looked at Nora. Nora looked back at him. They were both trying not to laugh. "Because walking is how we remember," Jonas said. "Remember what?" "Remember that some things are worth doing, even when they're hard. Remember that helping someone doesn't mean they have to know. Remember that the best gifts are the ones that cost something." Ellie considered this with the deep seriousness of a 4-year-old. "Like when Mommy gives me cookies? Exactly like that. Except Mommy walked 8 miles every week to give me cookies. For almost a whole year. That's a lot of walking." "It is. And I didn't even say thank you." "That wasn't very nice, Daddy." "No, it wasn't." Jonas scooped her up and settled her on his shoulders. "That's why I walk now. To show Mommy I learned." Nora shook her head, but she was smiling. "He's still learning. I'll always be learning." Jonas took her hand with his free one. "That's the point." They walked the rest of the trail together, father and mother and daughter, moving through the morning light like a small parade. At the halfway boulder, they stopped to rest. At the edge of town, they bought supplies. And then they turned around and walked home. 8 miles there, 8 miles back, 16 miles of family. Some distances, it turned out, weren't meant to be shortened. They were meant to be shared. The end.